Alright, let's talk about where English came from so that you can understand why we're going to do vocabulary the way that we do it. So first, think about what you can guess about English, actually, and what you know. So do you know anything about how or why languages change over time? What do you think about how old the English language is? Last, what other languages might be related to English? Jot down those ideas at the top of your pink paper, page 1 from class, and then come back to this video. Okay, so you should have some ideas. Let's see how many of those were on target. So first, the tree of Indo-European languages has to do with what languages are related to English. If you look down here at the bottom of the tree, all of these languages stem from Proto-Indo-European, which was a Stone Age language as far back as 5000 BC. If you look up way at English on the apple, you can see that the closest branch to English is West Germanic, which means that actually English is most closely related to German. Other languages that are related include the North Germanic languages, which are all the Scandinavian languages like Danish and Icelandic. And then on another branch, the Centum languages, are all of the Romance languages that come from Latin, such as Spanish and Portuguese. So you'll see that even though we have a lot of words in English that sound like words in Spanish or French or Italian, English is most closely related to German, which is a weird thing. And let's see how that happened. Before we think about that, think about where do you think English started? Do you think it started in England? This is England. This is the British Isles, so Scotland and England and Ireland. And it sounds like English started in England, right? Well, no. So would it surprise you to know that the answer is no, it didn't. Here's how it happened. Way back before 450 AD, there were the Celts, and they were native British people, kind of like our Native Americans, who lived in Ireland and England and the British Isles. The Celts were conquered by the Romans, and the Romans left England in 450 AD. Once the Romans left, the Vikings, who lived over in modern-day Germany and Denmark, over on the right of the map, realized they could come in and conquer this land because the Romans didn't hold it anymore. So you can see the yellow arrows are where the Anglo tribes came, the blue arrows where the Jutes came, and the red arrows where the Saxons came over from modern-day Germany and Denmark and took over modern-day England. So, the Angles and the Saxons migrated from the area that is now northern Germany, and they pushed the Celts to the north and to the west. So the Celts moved up, and the Angles and the Saxons moved in, right into the area that we now call England. The area that we call England then was named after the Angle invaders. That means that Anglian became England, and the Angles spoke the language that we now call English. The original English was called Anglo-Saxon, from the Angles and the Saxons, or Old English, and that's the roots of the English that we now speak. Keep in mind that the Angles and the Saxons did not start off in England, and so neither did English. It actually comes from Germany, and it's Germanic in origin. The first version of Anglo-Saxon, which is called Old English, dates back to about the year 500, and that's the first piece that we can read in Old English. Okay, so most Anglo-Saxon is not something that you would recognize, but some words from Anglo-Saxon are still in our language today. For example, you might have noticed how weird it is that and the in Spanish or French don't sound at all like and the in English, and that's because and the are Anglo-Saxon words. About 15% of our overall vocabulary is still related to Anglo-Saxon. And those words often sound like modern German, and they tend to be our most basic terms, things that we need for life and for survival. So for example, these are German words. Read through them out loud to yourself and see if you can guess what they mean in English. If you guessed the numbers, you're right. So if you read them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, I hope I said those right, you can hear how similar those sound to our numbers. And that's because the roots of the German and the English numbers are both in Anglo-Saxon. Some other words in German that also share roots with our words in English are this. Can you guess what that means? If you guessed house, you're right. This means man. This, Feuer, means fire. And this, Kuh, means cow. So you can start to hear the similarities in these very basic English words and how those go back to the same roots of modern German. 4 of our days of the week are named after the gods that the Angles and the Saxons worshipped. Can you guess which days those are? So Tuesday is named for a god Tu. So Tuesday is Tuesday. Wednesday is named for the god Woden. And so Wednesday is Woden's Day. You've probably heard of Thor, and Thursday is named after him. And then Woden's wife Frigg is who Friday was named after. So Friday is Frigg's Day. So again, we still see the influence of these old Anglo-Saxon words in our modern day English. So why doesn't modern English look and sound like Anglo-Saxon if it has the same roots as Anglo-Saxon? Well, languages change because people fight wars, and when power changes, the language that the people in power changes. The Anglo-Saxons got conquered by William of Normandy, who is also called William the Conqueror, in 1066 AD, so almost over 2,000 years ago, at the Battle of Hastings. The people in that battle who won was William the Conqueror's troops, and they spoke Anglo-Norman. They were the victors. Anglo-Saxons lost, and so Anglo-Saxon became the language of the beaten down and the lower classes. Anglo-Norman is related to French, so they came over from France, and the Anglo-Saxons were Germanic, and they were the people who lost the war. As they lost the war, the Germanic people, the poor people, had to raise the meat, but the French-speaking, the Anglo-Norman people, were the ones who had the money and the power to buy the meat and eat it. And so you can see that in the words that we use for animals versus the meat from the animals today. So the word cow is similar to the German word Kuh. But the word that we use for cow meat, which is beef, is similar to the French word for beef, which is Bœuf. In German, we call a pig or a swine a Schwein. But if we eat a Schwein, we call it pork, which is similar to the French word porc, okay, which means the meat from the pig. Again, in German, the word for deer is Hirsch, which sounds similar to deer, but the word for deer meat is venison, which sounds similar to the French venaison. So we can hear now the power structures that the German people raised the animals and sold the meat, but the French people who had more power and more money at that time because they had won the war, their words are the words that we use for the meat. So power and language are intertwined, and the words that we use reflect who was in power when our language was formed. Eventually, a third language comes into the picture. So we have Anglo-Saxons, and then we had the Anglo-Normans, who are early French, and then a third language came in, and that was the Roman Catholic Church. You might know that the Roman Catholic Church spoke Latin. There are some Roman Catholic churches who still do their masses in Latin, and they came throughout Europe starting churches and also starting universities who were run by the church. So both in church and in universities, people spoke Latin. Therefore, Latin became the language of learning, education, and worship across many countries in Europe and in England. So really, English is 3 languages in one. Its basis is Anglo-Saxon, which is related to German, and that was the home language of the poor, simple people in England. Anglo-Norman, which is related to French, was the language of power and business, because those are the people who won that war, and they were the people who had power. And then Latin became the language of the very educated, the monks, and the people who got to attend the university. So that's why English has over 250,000 words, more words than any other language. It's because we have a lot of times at least 3 different words that mean the same thing and 3 levels of fanciness. So if we were going to talk about a church or a very special place, we might call it holy. That word is related to German, heilig, and so that's the most basic word. A fancier way of saying holy is sacred, and that's related to the French word sacré, which also means sacred. Again, that was a slightly fancier group of people. And the fanciest word we can use for sacred or holy is sacrosanct, which comes from the Latin sacrosanctus. So again, we have 3 words that mean the same thing, but holy is not fancy, sacrosanct is very fancy, and that comes from the 3 different languages that combine together to make English. This matters because in language we have things called registers. Register is a particular language used for a particular purpose in a particular setting. And that's confusing until we look at it. So for example, there's several ways that I could ask somebody if we were going to hang out at his or her house. I could say, hey, yo, are we going to meet at your house? Or I could say, pardon me, might we convene at your domicile? If you look at the words in the first sentence, meet comes from Old English metan, which is to find or to encounter. House comes from Old English hus, which is a dwelling or a shelter, and it's obviously related to the German Haus. And gonna, or going, comes from Old English gan, which means to advance or to walk or depart, go away. So the informal version of English has those roots in Anglo-Saxon words. Are we going to meet at your house? In contrast, it sounds very snooty and fancy to say, pardon me, might we convene at your domicile? Let's look at where those words come from. Pardon comes from Old French, pardonner, which means to forgive, so that was a fancier level of English. The other two words here come from Latin. So convene comes from convenire, which is Latin for unite or assemble. And then domicile comes from Latin domicilium, which means home, and then also Old French domicile. So the words in the fancy register of English are related to Old French and to Latin, in contrast to the Anglo-Saxon words, which are related to German. So keep in mind as we do this talking about register that the words that come from Latin often sound the fanciest. So the words that come from that Latin branch of the tree sound the fanciest. So for example, culpable, exigent, explicate, augment, pensive, and ambivalent all sound pretty fancy, snooty, highly educated words. And that's because they come from the Latin branch. Here's the thing, if you speak Spanish or French or Italian or Portuguese, you can guess the meanings of those words much better than other speakers of English because those words often are not that fancy in another Romance language like Spanish. So for example, if we go back, culpable, if you know the word culpable in Spanish, it just means blamable, right? No tengo la culpa. And so culpable means that somebody could blame you for something. And now you know that word because you know Spanish or French. Exigent, think about what Spanish word you know that sounds like that. And it should be the verb exigir, which means to demand. And exigent just means that it is absolutely necessary. It's demanded on us. Explicate looks exactly like a verb in Spanish, which is explicar, which means to explain. And explicate just means to explain. Augment looks just like a Spanish word, which is aumentar, which means to grow, and augment also means to grow in size. Pensive looks just like a Spanish verb, which is pensar, and so being pensive is somebody who thinks a lot. Pensar means to think. And ambivalent is kind of a combination of two Spanish words, the word ambos, which means both, and vale, which means it's worth. So something that is ambivalent is kind of worth the same in either direction or in both directions. So again, if you know or study Spanish or French or Portuguese or Italian or Romanian, you're going to know a lot of fancy sounding words in English as well. You might be wondering just how different is Old English. I'd like you to try to read this out loud to yourself and see if you can guess what the text is. Go ahead and pause the video and read it to yourself now. Okay, so you read that to yourself. Let's try another version. So Old English, this is from 1000 AD. If we move forward a little closer to now, here's the same text written in Middle English, which was kind of a blend of French and English. This is from 1384 AD. Try to read this out loud to yourself and see if you can guess what it is. Okay, once you've tried that, we're moving forward to the last one. And so in early modern English, which is the language of Shakespeare, this is from 1611 AD, you probably recognize this text now. And so you can see how English has changed over time to get closer and closer to the English that we speak now. You'll see that Shakespeare did speak the same version of English as us, modern English, just an earlier version. But Middle English and Old English sound pretty different. And that's how English has changed over time, and that's why we spend time studying those Roman roots, those Latin roots, because they help us understand the patterns behind our fanciest words. And as we go forward, we'll be studying Latin roots to help you understand a lot of those words that will show up on the SAT or in more academic pieces of text to give you that power to use the fancy words that the monks had in their universities way back in the Middle Ages. Welcome to Vocabulary.